So dear all, good afternoon and welcome to this session on measuring cultural employment. Thanks again for joining us. Well, in this session, we would like to speak how we can fix this ongoing problem on measuring cultural employment. It was quite, I mean, everyone is saying it is notorious that it's pretty difficult to measure the number of jobs in these creative sectors, and we all want to have better data. Well, why is it different? Of course, because the creative jobs are spread across different sectors, so much beyond cultural and creatives. And I'm thinking about these famous examples of designers, for example, working in the automotive industry. It's pretty difficult for official statistics to capture the secondary employment or the voluntary work, which is very much present in, especially in cultural sectors, no? And also it was pretty difficult to draw some international comparisons because many countries, they define their creative sectors in very different ways. Of course, there are more or less the same understanding of what are the cultural sectors, but then when it comes to creatives, some would include video games or gardening sometimes, and others will not. So with that, that's making the task quite difficult. And when we go at subnational level, for example, at the regional level, it's even more difficult to do this kind of cross-country or within one country comparisons. And we heard today from the very beginning that it's very important to have this data. It was obvious for many in the past, of course, but now when governments, city governments, regional governments, national governments are designing support schemes, rescue schemes to support employment in the sector, they want to know, so what is the target population? How big should be this rescue package? And they don't have the answers always. So maybe this crisis will serve to finally have quite a considerable leap through in improving the data on cultural employment and on cultural and creative sectors more broadly. So once again, it is very important to have this evidence and this data for policymakers, for investors, for educational providers, and for citizens more in general. Today we have a fantastic panel. It's Europe, US, and a very strong region in Europe, Scotland. And we would like to hear from you on your different approaches and how we can, what are the potential answers to solve all these problems. So I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers today. Marta Beck-Domzalska from Eurostat, Sunil Iyengar, Director, Office of Research and Analysis from the National Endowment for the Arts from the United States, and Paul Zilli, our partner and our host in a way for this webinar, a Skills Planning Lead, Skills Development Scotland. What we thought maybe how to build this session, we would like maybe first to hear from you, from our speakers, on your main, what is your definition of cultural employment, maybe some kind of latest trends you observed over the past years on how cultural employment developed in Europe, in the United States, and in Scotland. And maybe some tips and tricks, maybe just some very brief initial remarks on how you measure secondary jobs, voluntary employment, and so that's maybe we'll start with that, and then we'll have a bit of a panel discussion to dig a little bit further. Shall I maybe invite Marta to start with your own remarks? And of course, Eurostat has done tremendous progress over the past decade or so in defining, in really providing quite a clear-cut definition of what are creative occupations and creative businesses. Well, the cultural statistics provided by Eurostat are extremely helpful, especially at the national level. So Marta, maybe you can take the floor.
Hello, everybody from Luxembourg. So I would say, I could say many things. It's very technical, so I will try to do the most important. So as you probably know, we have in Europe the concept of cultural employment. It is already the first first remark, because cultural employment is not creative and cultural employment. So we really based our employment data on, the final report of our network, European Network on Culture, with the framework of culture, for culture, only culture in Europe. For the moment, there are some projects ongoing to define more and work more about the concept definition of creative and cultural sectors in general, but this is another issue. So we have the concept of cultural employment, and maybe you know that we do, I think, the best. So we are mixing activities with occupations. So we take profit from NACE, classification of economic activities, and base it on ISCO, classification of occupations. So we take all employment in cultural sectors, cultural occupations and no cultural occupations, and we add all cultural occupation which are, employed outside cultural sectors. So I think that approach is really, good, and try to be the best. But what we have as a problem, it's the level of details in our European labor force survey. So we take the NACE 3-digit for economic activities and 4-digit for ISCO, and not for the moment, not all countries transmitted us this data at these levels. But it is a good news from this year, 21, we have a new regulation on social statistics, and these details will be available from this year. So available in Eurobase next year as data in Eurostat website. We will have this data now. It will be really, really easier because now we have a matrix with estimation of missing codes based off the European averages. So it's very complicated program to construct this, but the approach is interesting. It's really very inclusive. So what to say? This data we have, it is, we have many different variables, social variables, which could be investigated with this. So we have, of course, age, sex, educational attainment. We have some information about part-time, even secondary jobs, but it is another issue. And it will be really close with many social variables. And now, if we have no matrix, it will be even easier. Okay. So it is the first thing. About other data sources, we have Eurostat, for example, structural business statistics. So with the variable, of course, of number of employed people. But the issue is, the first one is that not all sectors were covered for today, but it will change just this year. All sectors will be covered. This is the progress. So we will have all sectors in LSBS, cultural sectors, even 1991 of the NACE. So it will be good, but the issue is the structural business statistics cover not all small enterprises. It depends really on the country. There is a threshold of coverage, and many small enterprises and even, in self-employed are not covered. So we really miss some employment in these sectors. It's sure. We have as well some information in business demographic data as well, of course. So there are, we have labor force survey of households with the best approach, and we have some information, and we'll have in the future even best, information from more business registers, all this type of data, but some employed are not covered there. So it will be always this issue of coverage of this business registers for the small enterprises and self-employed. So it is one thing. And after, I would like to say you that, because I think it is interesting and important, we will publish relatively soon, in coming weeks, probably, the regional data for this cultural employment. So it should be maybe explained that this regional data covered, so NUTS 1 level and NUTS 2 level. NUTS 2 level in some country there are some, how to say, big cities, and so it could be used for big cities and metropolitan areas. You see, so this how to say, the total employment, cultural employment, even and the levels of big city in some countries will be available. So I think it is good. And we have as well data, of course, it is one of the variables in the LFS, is degree of urbanization, is another approach, but we have for all people information where are they are living. So we have the cities, the suburbs and small cities and rural areas. So it is completely another aspect of this subnational data. Maybe two things to add, then we are now ongoing, maybe you are aware, the statisticians, the NACE revision. NACE revision and I think it's already even started, ISIC revision. So we would like to cover better cultural sector, because for the moment it's not really ideal, you know. So probably it will be the relatively big changes in division 1991 of NACE. So let's see, it's really for the future to cover better cultural activities. What I can say about the numbers, you know, it is sad, but we have lost last time because of Brexit, more than 1 million people in creative sectors. It's very a pity, but okay, it's like this. So now we have a 7,400,000 people from 2019 data. We will have soon 2020 data. So you see, it is more than 7 million of people. We know some characteristics of them, about educational attainment very high, about importance of part-time, of self-employed, of course, etc. You can find all the information if you are interested. We are really in Eurostat, culture statistics. We have much information, methodological information, how we calculate, and of course all tables. So there are many tables. We have the article on cultural employment, etc. So it is really many things to say about it, about secondary jobs. So the second job is captured, but only at 2-digit level of NACE. So we don't have really all really secondary jobs in cultural sectors. So, but okay, we can have another approach. So not to this matrix occupation and activities, but to take very simply only the NACE sectors at 2-digit levels. You know, there are 6 really fully cultural, and analyze different dimension on in this way. And okay, about the crisis, we have already constructed, it's the first time we have calculated cultural employment for quarters. It was never done before. So now we are looking at the data. We have Q2 and very soon Q3. Just to tell you, it's not published for the moment, but if it is about the level of employment, the increase is not big. In Q2, comparing to first one, let's see the Q3. We will publish this, and after it is the issue, I think, to have more information about, for example, the duration of the job, etc. We should to take only nice sectors, not the cultural employment, because we cannot mix this type of variables. So we will see what is really the most relevant to show, because we will have quarterly data from the LFS, of course. So I think it is the most things to be said, but we will discuss after, of course, as well about the particular questions. Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Marta. Yes, it was very important to hear, well, how you measure these things. So it's really looking into a mix of occupations and economic activities. Well, you criticize, you say that it doesn't capture all the creative jobs, but still it is a very comprehensive methodology. And the good news that you shared is, of course, that in structural business statistics now, very soon, all sectors will be covered from this year. And that also that there are ongoing revisions on NACI codes, so there will be even more comprehensive, better cover of cultural activities. And that also that you're going subnational now, so there will be also data available at NUTS1, NUTS2 region. So that's really a lot of progress. And you are also addressing this issue of data timelessness by now deciding to publish quarterly the updates on cultural employment statistics. Sunil, so maybe we can turn now to the US. Maybe you can also kick off with this a bit maybe a broad overview so that we get started.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me and great to be here. So can you hear me okay? First of all,
It's a bit low, but
still low? Okay, let me try this. Is it better? Works? A little better? Can you hear me now?
yeah.
Okay, it's better? Okay, I'll try to talk more loudly. Thank you, everyone. I was taken by your question about, do we have a working definition for arts and culture? And in contrast to a lot of other countries where I see that they have a definition that they can then use in building their data collections and thinking through their taxonomies, I think in the US, it's very much more of a kind of process of deduction rather than induction. So we really are bound very much by the limitations of our own data infrastructure and the definitions that are inherent in particularly our Census Bureau data collection systems. Most of our foundational data systems for arts and culture in the US were not designed to answer questions for researchers or practitioners in the arts, particularly, as you can imagine. Therefore, for arts and cultural employment, we rely on sifting through occupation and industry codes to identify these types of cultural workers. And I've said cultural workers, however, because the research goal of the National Endowment for the Arts is to promote knowledge about the value and impact of the arts. We study artists in particular. So we track 11 distinct artist occupations through the US Census Bureau and have done so since the 1970s, in fact. And I'll just, I could go down the list for you, but there are 11 distinct categories of artists that you could imagine. And I'm happy to go through those if needed. And the current US sources for those data are the American Community Survey, which is a rolling sample, and the current population survey. Both are administered by the US Census Bureau. And these give us, as Marta was saying about some of their data, good geographic, demographic characteristics of these artists, as well as what sectors they're employed in, their wages, median wages, et cetera. It also includes self-employed workers, whether they have part-time or full-time status and other things. But in fact, I'll just lean a little bit on our most recent report of a couple of years ago by a statistician named Bonnie Nichols in our office. As we reported, there are roughly 2.5 million artists in the US, that was as of a couple of years ago, who are either self-employed or wage and salary workers. We also looked, though, for that report at the number of workers in what might be regarded other cultural occupations, so very much in keeping with today's talk. So we did look at non-artists. But again, this was done through deduction, not induction. So it wasn't like we centralized a definition and then went out and chose occupations that met that definition. It was more like we went down a list of available occupation codes and chose those that frankly had face validity and made sense based on common parlance and really based on other countries' definitions too of cultural workers. So we came up with a range of them, from archivists to curators to librarians to editors to broadcast and sound engineering folks, projectionists, lobby attendants, on and on, jewelers, metal workers, a whole bunch of those. And in all, we estimated about 1.3 million workers in this category. So if you add that to the 2.5, I guess you get about 3.8 million workers just by occupation in the arts and cultural sector. Who are either self-employed again or wage and salary workers. So that seems simple, right? Not really. My theme here is that we were really constrained by, as analysts, by the definitions implicit in the structured data elements. So, but we're also, constrained by the source of the data, right? The provenance. So for example, the 2.5 million artists I mentioned comes from a household survey, as I said, which asks people to identify their jobs based on the greatest number of hours worked on a given week. So these are people whose primary job is as an artist. And I know you're interested in knowing about secondary employment. So one of the surveys that we track, actually, the CPS, the Current Population Survey, actually asks about secondary jobs that workers might hold. And we find that there are about 333,000 workers whose primary job is something else, but who also work as artists, for example. So, returning to that, 3.8 million cultural workers figure, that gives us a different, obviously that's different. Now, just to say again, these numbers are household survey numbers. So when I talked about the provenance, I'm thinking, and where these data come from, I want to just, say that, of course, another major source is business establishment data. So industry, coming from the industries directly. So for that, we've leaned on an account, our satellite account, the Arts and Cultural Production satellite account, which itself relies on a variety of data sources, including economic census and survey of businesses and other places. And these show us that there are 5 million people who work for arts, and more than 5 million people who work in arts and cultural industries. And these are, just to be clear, how that's different from the 3.8. The 3.8 million were people by occupation, right? This is by industry. So they could have any occupational title, any occupation, but they're working in these industries for these businesses. And these are people on salary. And of course, we know artists in our data show that they're 3.5 times as likely as workers in general to be self-employed. So we're not capturing a lot of these contractual or gig workers. Just to tell you, in the wake of COVID-19, we've worked with FEMA. FEMA, is our federal agency for disaster relief and emergency preparedness. They did see the threat to the arts sector as a vulnerability that was worth putting under a magnifying glass. So they worked with Bonnie Nichols and our office and myself to produce a white paper describing the economic impact on our sector. That's up on our website, arts.gov. Just to give you a couple of glimpses of that, we found that among performing arts businesses alone, the number of workers on payroll fell by half from January to October 2020. So that's performing arts employment. But of course, those are actually on payroll. And again, as we just said, artists in the gig economy and self-employed artists, are abundant in the US and everywhere else. And we don't quite have a good grasp yet on how that subsector is hit. When we look at the performing arts again, when we look by occupation, we find that the unemployment rate, this is from the start of 2020 to the fall of 2020, we're looking at new numbers right now, but over that period, the unemployment rate for dancers and choreographers was over 54%, compared to an 8.5% unemployment rate for all workers. For actors, it was 52%. For those whose main job was a musician, it was 27%. And of course, there's very many regional differences, and that has to be emphasized. We get a couple of irate calls from New York saying, hey, I saw in the New York Times that it says the NEA says that there's a 27% unemployment rate. In New York, it's 99%. And, so there's clearly going to be regional variations. And that's true, of course, of all these data. So I will just end on a couple of other things, hopefully addressing interests here. So one innovative project that we've had the pleasure of working on in collaboration with the Ford Foundation and the Knight Foundation has been to understand this sector of artists who may not even consider themselves artists, but who essentially use technology as a creative medium. So technologists, artists, people in that space who are creating for video game design, who are doing other, who are these people? I just named virtual reality, whole range of kinds of coding, creative coding. Who are these workers and what is their support system? What is their pipeline? And I've neglected to say that in all these studies, we also try to look when we can, especially with the census data, at education also. So educational support systems, how did they get to where they are? What are their needs? And this was done very much a qualitative research project. So it involved about dozens of several interviews and workshops around the country in the US to sort of town hall meetings to try to understand more about these workers and their needs. So we'll be putting out a report this spring about that with our Media Arts Office. And then just landing on a couple of things, volunteerism. So that is, of course, a very important part of the sector. And we do have separate households. So the current population survey that I mentioned has a supplement, or had a supplement, tracking volunteerism and charity work. So we have consistently looked at those data and pulled numbers about volunteers, those who volunteer in the arts, and those who do charity work for various arts organizations, for example. And we tallied around 2.3 million people doing that work, almost as much as the number of artists that we counted. And we tried to, they contributed totally around 210 million hours. We estimated that value through an algorithm at about $13 billion. So I don't have the details on how we came up with that, but I do know it was pretty rigorous, and my analysts did the work, and we supervised it years ago. We probably should revisit that analysis now, of course. And that gets to my final point, which is the regularity and the frequency, really the frequency or the periodicity in which we report, with which we report data. And Marta mentioned this in her case. So we have a limited staff, as many of you do, lean, but very, I like to think very productive. And I've been worried, just as a director of the research office for many years at the NEA, I've been always concerned about sustainability, with different needs of different administrations coming into the NEA, and as well as people's own career trajectories. And so this is a fairly specialized skill set to delve into arts and cultural data from these government sources and to tally them and analyze them and make comparisons over years. And so it's really, we've been very reliant on what we could do in any given year. So it hasn't been as consistent as I'd like. So what we're going to try to do is emulate some of the countries that have set up things like statistical observatories. And we're very interested in doing something like that this year, or at least to put out a call for an entity that could serve as our kind of arm's length body that could work with us to produce these kinds of statistics on a more regular basis. But to do that, we don't want to kind of, even though this will be affiliated with the National Endowment for the Arts, we would like there to be a sounding board or an advisory group or technical working group that could consist of artists, arts organizations, practitioners, the cultural economists, others, policymakers, who could advise and kind of help to set the priorities as to what the schedule is for these data releases based on who's likely to benefit the most from them over what period of time. And that really has to do with a lot of overall federal statistics about the arts, not just employment. So I'll end there. Hope I've hit most of the major topics. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sunil. And yes, what was very impressive to hear, well, of course, I mean, this sad figures on this very high shares of unemployment in different categories compared, well, you were mentioning performing artists and etc., compared to an average that's really quite dramatic. And also you underline this geographical distribution of things with big cities like, well, of course, New York and probably some other cities as well, suffering most. But it's very good to hear that you are considering to create this observatory to publish and make available this data on a more regular basis. And of course, we'll be very excited to be connected to this stream of work. Now, maybe I would like to turn to Paul. Of course, the United Kingdom and Scotland in particular, you for already quite some decades now, you were quite strong with, defining the cultural and creative sectors and collecting data on those, and importantly also feeding all this information into the policy design. So maybe, Paul, maybe you can also say a few words about how was this happening and what is happening now as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks very much for the opportunity. And I've got a couple of slides if we could bring those up as well. Thank you. Just skip on. It's great to be here over this time and for Glasgow City Region to co-host this event today and tomorrow. We brought together a partnership that's been involved with that, which involves our national devolved government, 3 of its national agencies responsible for enterprise, responsible for arts and cultural development, and responsible for jobs, plus our largest region, our metropolitan region of Glasgow City Region, to be involved right through this process. And culture and creative industries and job opportunities from that are absolutely central to the work that we're involved in doing. Can we skip on, please? Again, I'm not going to go through this, and sorry, some of the, sorry, back on. We've got the details here. Some of the linings are awry, but you'll see the details there. As Katja has said, there is a definition that we've worked to for a fair period of time there. It's similar, but not the same as the UK definition. But that focus on individual creativity, skills and talents, potential to create wealth and jobs through development or production of intellectual property. And you'll see the 16 subsectors that are underway there in our formal definition. Just skip on for numbers. It's recognised as one of Scotland's key sectors, and therefore individual information around job numbers, around business growth, around opportunities for further development are tracked fairly rigorously. And again, I'm not going to go through these in detail, but you can see it is significant in the size of what we're doing. 9% of total companies, 3% of total employment. Significant in terms of GVA and exports. And I will just major on that last one in terms of research and development, partly because of the focus around design and software, etc. Disproportionately important in terms of research and development spend. As with Marta and Sunil, I will note the limitations of the data. The bulk of what we report on is built up from company returns, from payroll returns, from individual employee returns, and therefore the extent to which people who have arts jobs as second careers or who do it voluntarily probably links to how formal and how recorded that interaction is. For example, I would expect that if it was 100% voluntary roles, none of that would be captured in the figures I've got here. And similar to Sunil, the amount of volunteer input into the creative and cultural industries is really, really significant in Scotland. And in terms of second jobs, it will depend upon that formality and how that's structured. When I come on to talk about the impact of the pandemic, the informality of some of those employment mechanisms has had a very difficult and disadvantageous impact on people looking for support from national and regional schemes. Can we skip on, please? Pre-pandemic, because creative and cultural industries were part of one of those key sectors, and were also seen as having a role in the sort of twin pillars of Scotland's economic development strategy, which looked for growth in productivity, but also economic inclusion. And creative and cultural industries were seen as being a very good example of what could develop there. And so there was a forward plan, the Economic Action Plan, that was published just a few months before the pandemic, which focused around these measures. And many of them have already been touched upon in the session today. That importance of developing and retaining skills, and indeed, upskilling and reskilling being central to that. Appropriate business support for creative and cultural industries. And then where creative and cultural industries can support wider policy priorities. So building Scotland's international profile, recognising the innovation that came through, particularly some of the subsectors and the transferability of that. That focus around inclusiveness and supporting economic inclusion more broadly. Particular focus on design. You heard Janice earlier on screen industries as areas for growth in Scotland. And also the importance of place. And in part, that's the reason why we're here as a sort of a city region today. That metropolitan region, there's been a bit of rethinking around the importance about particularly metropolitan regions and their importance into both economic development and inclusion going forward. And again, creative and cultural industry is really, really central to that. Can you skip on, please? Impact of the pandemic, has been horrible, as everybody has said. It's a continually evolving situation. And some of the information that we've picked up from the partners, and it continues to be monitored on an ongoing basis, is that impact is certainly not equal across the sector. And again, we've already heard a lot of that. We've seen real impact in music, performing arts, venue-based activities. On the other side, those that have more of a focus on digital and digital economy, often are buoyant, in some cases, sort of in expansionary mode. Creative and cultural sectors have made really high levels of use of the coronavirus job retention scheme, the furlough scheme, of which there's different models right across EU and beyond. And actually, when you look at the figures at the moment, we still think that the extension of furlough has masked what that sort of medium-term employment impact is going to be. The most recent figures in the last couple of weeks have got a couple of numbers that look quite anomalous, where we're not seeing the big spike in unemployment that we expected at this point, but at the same time, numbers of quoted payroll personnel is significantly down. Now, whether that's just a lag in the two figures and they will catch up with each other, or whether it means that people are doing other things where they can in the short term to manage, I think that needs to be seen over the next wee while. What we have seen is notified redundancies at a number of major arts and cultural industry companies, and we'll see more of that. The related industries, obviously, around tourism, around retail, food and drink service sector, very, very significantly decimated. And again, relaying back to some of the figures that were quoted earlier on, not all sectors have fared equally. Again, using a Glasgow City region lens, we've probably got about 100,000 young people between the ages of 16 and 25 whose employment is vulnerable. They're people who are current or pending school leavers, people about to leave college or university, often supporting that activity with part-time work in some of the industries most impacted, and people who've gone through sort of formal apprenticeships, work-based learning type activities, which have been really hit hard this year. And so that focus on opportunities for that vulnerable group and trying to introduce a young person's guarantee has been a central focus of agencies moving forward. What you also see on this slide is, there's been a lot of support for the sector via the national agencies. Local authorities have played a really big part in that. Creative Scotland has been central in individual support for the sector. Scottish Enterprise, very big in terms of supporting significant enterprises, pivotal enterprises as they're called in the jargon. Some of the things that Creative Scotland particularly has looked at doing is people who've fallen through the net of the UK national schemes and looking at emergency support for freelancers who don't fit in with that activity. And there's now a large sort of plethora of funds and initiatives that have tried to support particular subsectors within that. We've avoided this question when it's come up in the chat thus far on the session, but the end of the Brexit transition period also has a very significant impact on this sector going forward. And again, we think in the medium term will absolutely have a important impact on job numbers going forward. And what we're beginning to see, and we'll maybe pick up this in some of the questions, for those that are able to survive, there are some interesting new business models, and people again have already spoken earlier on about hybrid models coming forward when we think about festival delivery. January would normally be Celtic Connections in January. We normally welcome international visitors from across the world celebrating Celtic music and heritage. It's all online this year, as you would expect. February is typically the Glasgow International Film Festival, usually 180 premieres. It's going ahead online. There are 60. There's a business model about paying market rate for that. We'll see whether that works. It may be that becomes part of the hybrid model going forward. Paisley Book Festival next year, all online. As you see the calendar of artistic events, you can see what's happening. We've had some announcements even this morning around some of the big Edinburgh festivals that are still planning for hybrids, but obviously that will be subject to how the health condition, how the pandemic moves forward and what guidelines are in place at that point. Can you move on, please? Just a few sort of closing comments around what's happening now and what that means for the sector and for our partnership in terms of planning. There continues to be a big focus on emergency funding, and some people have described that some of the agencies and local authority departments have done very little else other than just manage getting money out to companies and individuals that otherwise would no longer be working over that period of time. We're seeing deadlines come up in the coming months about when that support is currently expected to end. There's a question about whether that will align with when we start to see widespread take-up of the vaccine and hopefully a move to the return to some of our creative and cultural industries going forward. As a partnership, we keep this constantly under review, and we do publish on a monthly basis a review that has a look at notified redundancies, current figures around employment, unemployment, furlough, levels of business confidence that our business organisation partners carry out for us. We use online scrape data to look at vacancy numbers and a sort of a match in terms of the skills that are required for those vacancies that are live now with where we think the biggest fall is in people who are facing redundancy and unemployment, and ensuring that that does have both a regional lens and a sectoral lens so that we can provide some sort of nuanced commentary which hopefully will inform how public sector and other spend is invested going forward. Scenario planning has been a big element of that, looking at the different types of recovery that we might expect, modelled on other economic shocks, previous pandemics, and doing that whole spectrum of good news, bad news, and all points in between, trying to model what we might need to do going forward. And then, and again, crucially for this sector, what input there might be in terms of economic recovery plans, but also social recovery plans. And we're seeing some really positive propositions around how some of the repurposing that is currently underway can also help with both our economic and social recovery going forward. Okay, that's my sort of opening comments. I'm happy to pick up anything more in questions, or indeed to connect you to any of the partners from Glasgow City Region and Scotland who've been involved in this work. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Paul. Yes, and it looks like you do have this, well, rather comprehensive way of doing things, and you combine official statistics, non-official data sources to provide timely, almost close to real-time data on regional variations and on sectoral variations. So I mean, in the times like today, that's extremely important, and that's really great. I will be quite curious to understand, maybe not now for this conversation, but in general, many people are saying that, of course, well, there are all the venue-based sectors are very severely affected, but maybe IT, design, digital services are not so affected. But I think the picture there is also quite mixed, because yes, some of the firms, they are skyrocketing for obvious reasons. But many smaller firms, they used to work with other corporations, and other corporations were using their marketing budgets to commission this kind of services, and these are the budgets that are cut first or put on ice. So maybe also the picture there is somehow mixed, but maybe that's a subject for another conversation. Maybe before we go into next round of questions, I wanted to flag to Martha that there was a very concrete question on your presentation, and that was, oh, I don't see it anymore. Yeah, it wasn't the live chat. Maybe you answered it already. Just a sec. Was it about the structural business statistics?
Is it the one that says, do you consider the Orbis database a good?
No, it was another one. Yeah, but we can, okay, maybe I'll find it and I'll ask it later on. Yes, so in all your interventions, you of course highlighted this need and the difficulty, of course, of capturing the secondary employment and the voluntary employment. And you already provided some tips and tricks on how you are doing that. But maybe we can dig a little bit further on that. What would be your advice, especially your advice, well, of course, to national governments, but also to cities and regions, on how they can measure these two types of employment, maybe, of course, using the official statistics, but also the other complementary data sources. And can we also use sources like job centers registered or social insurance or tax data to capture a little bit better the employment and fill these gaps? So maybe I can ask Sunil to say a few words about this if you want.
Sure. Well, just on the voluntary employment piece, I do think there could be more emphasis in advocacy and education about what that means for the arts sector. Like, why is that important to track? Like, what is the relevance of it? I think, I mean, I don't think I'm going out on a limb when I say in the US, I don't think there's a great enough appreciation of that as part of the workforce, or thinking about it as part of the workforce. And so our attempts to try to monetize that or understand what the monetary value would be associated with that labor, and looking at economic studies that can tell us that, might go some way to convincing policymakers and researchers for that matter, in that this is an area worth really spending time focusing on. It also speaks to another narrative in the arts ecosystem, which is about not only that there's all this grassroots these grassroots contributions by society to people who have a vested part in the arts as volunteers, but it speaks to a larger narrative about social cohesion and civic engagement in the US that I think could be very attractive to people if they had those numbers to fall back on and to talk about. So I think I'm more thinking about it from a communications perspective, because I don't think it's as challenging, perhaps I'm naive here, in the US to pull those kinds of numbers and to make some kind of analysis about the voluntary segment of society. But the other thing I would say, since you mentioned other data sources, we haven't done this yet, and I would really be curious and would want to do this in the future, is to merge our census data with administrative data from other sources. And that's a big theme in the Census Bureau right now. And for many years, they've been trying to modernize and think of ways to allow researchers access to not only the original research data from the surveys, but to pair that with other existing data sets, and particularly, again, administrative data. And one survey I think that has a lot of potential for that, for us to mine in the US, is called the Longitudinal Employer Household. It says a D at the end of it. I can't believe I'm mistaking it's LEHD, I believe. It's actually, it's dynamics. D is for dynamics. Mm-hmm. And it's a survey that does manage to pull data from, I believe it's state unemployment offices, mm-hmm. as well as census data, household survey data. And it does some web scrapes, if I'm not mistaken, and it pulls job postings, in fact. So we have some information on sort of vacancies in various occupations through that data source. And we have actually haven't used it much at the NEA, but that's the kind of data source I'm talking about that could be the future of, if we're going to continue to rely on surveys, to make sure that we're also trying to get some observational data from these other sources that may lend more validity to that data, or may shift the context a bit in the frame of the data, so we could use it for some of these policy questions. So yeah, that's all I could say for now, I guess.
Yes, maybe Martha, I don't know if you want to add a few words on this issue of measuring the secondary employment and voluntary employment. What would be your tips and tricks? Well, we heard that things are really going quite quick and improving. What Eurostat is measuring will be measuring, but what your advice to countries as well?
I would say that for second jobs in the LFS, we could do better. So we in general in Europe, it is, I think, 8% of person employed in cultural sectors or occupation having the secondary job, what we know. But we have not yet explored the inverse situation. So the people working in other sectors, but employed in cultural sector as the second job. So, but as the data was not enough, but I think at 2-digit level we could do something. It is some new idea. Okay, it is of course labor force survey. It is the sample household survey. Okay, but we will explore this as well. About voluntary activity, just to tell you two different approach. So we have nothing in the LFS, of course. But there are two small sources will be, maybe you know in the data museums collected by EGMUS, a network of museum statistics, they have questions. There are many countries having data voluntaries working in museums. It's already a part of information, but okay, it's something. And the second thing I have just thought about it, we have the survey of income and living conditions, SILC in Europe, a big survey, the most important survey on it. And we have ad hoc modules on cultural participation every 6 years only. But okay, 2022, next year, it will be the module like this. And we have included information, the question about just voluntary activity in cultural organizations. So this is something new. So it will be, something. We can after see how many people are involved and with which characteristics, of course, social characteristics. So, but really, the number of persons, for example, as voluntary, I think it's too difficult. Right? For the moment, I don't know how to capture them.
Thank you, Martha. Paul, I wanted to turn to you because you mentioned, and well, we know that in your work you combine different data sources, including this web scraping, and this can be helpful also to understand the employer's demand for creative skills somehow. Based on your experience, what are the pros and cons of combining official data sources and web scraping, and how you would, if you think you are advising other places, the cities and regions on doing so, what will be your advice on that?
Thank you. One of the things that we're very interested in at the moment is getting a better alignment in skills between demand and supply. Looking at what the spend is around colleges, universities and work-based learning, and how that relates to the actual job vacancies that are out there at the moment. So the web scraping has been particularly important for that, because what that does allow us to do is to have a look at vacancies that have been advertised, and with every iteration of the service, it gets better. So you can you can be very specific about job titles or about skills that are required, or the geographic profile, and get some sense around the volume of roles that have been advertised over that period of time. And I think that's also been useful in terms of it's always have to put a health warning around it. It's not it's not statistically sound in terms of publishing that activity. It's not going to be every vacancy. It obviously pulls data down from a range of different sites. It does try and strip out duplicates, but I'm not sure that it does that in 100% of cases. And obviously roles that are advertised in different ways would not be picked up through that web scraping piece, and that might be particularly pertinent for some of the roles that we're talking about within creative and cultural sectors. But it has been a useful additional dimension at looking at that. And we use that alongside some traditional measures, such as historic data around demand and supply for skills, current level of supply in that area, and also traditional economic forecasts, and ensuring that those economic forecasting models have built in planned changes, planned shocks. I'm not sure any of the ones a year ago had anticipated what we would have for this year going forward, but it's another tool in looking at this going forward. Maybe I will accelerate a little bit with my questions, because we don't have much time left, and I had a very enormous and important question for you. Well, as we were saying in the beginning, of course, this cross-country comparison is pretty difficult, but it's
the core of what we are trying to do as OECD. And it's even more difficult to go subnational, that's one, that's two, and provide these comparisons across countries because of different definitions, etc. But if we want to go forward with this, well, and one of the reasons is also different occupational and industries codes in Europe, for example, and in the US, they don't allow for an easy comparison. But what's your view, how we can go about it as a large-scale effort for the future? And maybe it would be great to hear from Sunil and Marta on this.
My response, sadly, I don't think it will be very helpful. I would love nothing better. I think that's, I mean, in terms of being able to have cross comparisons and to have code alignments and some of the choices of codes and how we, you know, to arrive at a standard like that or to adhere to the standards. When I say it's sad is because I don't think we're at that stage yet with our own data infrastructure or getting consensus, if you will, around our own stakeholders, around which data elements we want to routinely report on in a manner that we feel confident enough to then broadcast that and say, this is what we would like to see from other countries, and, you know, can we have a discussion about it? I do think we should start that discussion. And I'm sad, I mean, I wish I'd been more engaged with OECD, and now this is a great opportunity to do so. To get started on these kinds of conversations. I know in the past, my colleague Bonnie Nichols has attended meetings of OECD and has tried to lend some advice, technical advice. But one thing we have an opportunity to do now, as I've said, with this, if we do a sort of an observatory approach or a research center that's generating statistics, again, if we can bring some cohesion to what we as an agency are able to report frequently, which we periodically report these data, but it is very much, seems very ad hoc. So if we bring some stability to that over the and a long-term plan for releasing statistical reports about, say, employment, then I think we'll be in a much better position to confidently go and have these discussions about how to make that alignment and what kinds of classification changes we would like to get people to look at. I would urge people, though, to look at our arts and cultural production satellite account. That is, if there's any kind of basis for our definitions of the arts and cultural industry, it's really coming from that. And that was an effort of international consultation and internal consultation to produce, domestic consultation to produce this account. And that may give some guidance for others seeking to do that kind of work, but it doesn't speak to the code problem for occupations. So I'm talking here specifically about occupations. I think we need to kind of get our own house in order in terms of some of the, how to do primary and secondary and how to do that in a very reliable way, consistent way. And then we can perhaps have a discussion with other countries.
Thank you so much. Marta, what's your take on this issue of comparability?
No, I am a very practical person because I know very well all the problems of comparability. So I would propose, you know, there are the collection of data and employment by the UNESCO Institute of Statistics as well. And I think that will continue, but okay. The only thing to do, it's to have a core of sectors or occupations common for all, just to define this, and after collect the data for only for these sectors, knowing of course that there is some limitation. It is certainly underestimation, but not so big, because if in the 6 nice sectors which are really fully cultural, we can have this data. I suppose it is 90, I don't know exactly, but 90% of cultural employment, of cultural sectors in employment. So, but because it is not possible to do in another way, so to maybe establish, really it is very simple, is you know, 18, it is, I don't know, maybe not, but okay, 50 from the NACE, okay, it's NACE or ISIC. I think all countries have this about employment in NACE or ISIC sectors at 2-digit level is not, I think it is available. And okay, to take only this approach to take this, or it could be to the same way to put the core of cultural occupation at 3-digit level of ISCO, but okay, if this is not available in other countries, there are some correspondence, I suppose, nearly. But this is the only thing to put together the core, and after really clearly to compare the core, what is feasible, I think.
Yes, thank you,
Because
Marta.
that definition, even in Europe, some countries are using already our matrix, but not all. But the most important is to really clearly to say what is covered, because if not, of course, it is anyway it is not comparable very often. But to have a core, it will be a good idea, I think. So.
No, very, very good, Marta. That's very practical advice, and probably it's not tremendously difficult to crosswalk between the different occupational and economic activity codes between Europe, North America, and maybe some other OECD countries beyond Europe.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I don't know how to make the thumbs up icon, but I was going to say I really like that idea, Mara. That's something we'd be happy to look into as well.
Fantastic. Maybe, well, there are plenty of things. This is really a theme for days and days of work and discussions. But I wanted to now turn to Professor Joanna Woronkovich from University of Indiana, who is with us today also to help to draw some conclusions from what we were saying now and discussing. Joanna, I hope you can join us now. Please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Katya. Thank you to the panelists. A really complex and interesting discussion, especially how it relates to the panel right before this on the impact of COVID-19 on the cultural employment workforce. So the panelists, I'm just going to make a few comments here, and a lot of this is summary, but I think also I'm going to address some of Katya's questions with providing possible solutions to some of the problems that have been discussed here. So I think in general, the panelists really addressed very well the practical issues with measuring cultural employment, but there are also, I believe, these theoretical issues. So even among these panelists and the panel that we saw previous to this panel, we use the term we use to describe cultural employment is quite different. So some of us use the term artist, some of us use the word cultural worker or creative worker, and we are all likely defining this term differently. So is the artist, is that a self-definition? Do I define myself as an artist? Is that defined by the industry or occupation one works in? Is that defined by the time that a person spends in his or her day? And then, of course, there's this very ambiguous definition of what actually is art. Is that something that has a market value? Is this something that I create in the comfort of my own home for my own enjoyment? And this is the question that partly is what makes the term artist or cultural worker or creative worker so ambiguous and difficult to measure. And then there's also this big question of whether being an artist is like any other job, right? And I'm using this term job specifically. So jobs typically involve spending time, often with remuneration, to create a product. But like many of the panelists have mentioned in this webinar and in this panel and the previous panel, is that there's a great deal of uncertainty that goes along with being an artist, a creative worker, a cultural worker, in terms of the time someone spends to create a product and then how that product is then received on the market, right? And so this reason and the reasons about the ambiguity of the terms we use are really just some of the reasons that measuring cultural employment is so difficult to do, and why we're having this very short but complex conversation right now, and why this conversation is ongoing for so many people and places who do measurements of cultural employment. So, but notwithstanding the difficulty of measuring cultural employment, so many national governments and policymakers, researchers, we have proposed methodologies for measuring. And we heard already in this panel from Marta Beck at Eurostat, they have their own methodology. We heard from Sunil Iyengar at the National Endowment for the Arts in the US, that the US has their own methodology based on occupations. And then from Paul Zealy here at Skills Development Scotland, that they have their own definition based on sectors and industries. We could argue, I think, that these methods that we're hearing about are actually somewhat arbitrary, given that they none of these methods really fully encapsulate the myriad definitions of what an artist or a creative worker or a cultural worker really is. So, for example, do we include the food and hospitality industry or not? There are lots of questions like this that we make sort of subjectively based on what our interests are in measuring. But we can also probably argue that the methods that are used give us a glimpse into the relationships between artistic work and economic activity, and then they help us design policies to support workers. And I think it is this latter point, the designing of policies, that we're interested in. It is why we're interested in defining what an artist or creative or cultural worker is in the first place. So with this goal in mind, then I ask the question of, well, then how can we improve the way that we measure cultural employment? So a summary of the problems I think I heard in this panel with potential solutions. And these are also summaries, a summary of the problems that I encounter in my own work on cultural employment measurement. So this big problem is obviously the undercounting of cultural and creative workers, since many of these workers do their work in secondary employment situations that especially national level data collection efforts don't cover. Another problem is that official statistics by national governments are generally samples, right? So the workers in cultural and creative sectors, industries, occupations aren't always measured at the level of detail that we want them to be measured in because they're not included in the sample. And this is particularly difficult if we want to get regional measurements or greater levels of detail beyond the 2-digit economic activity or occupation codes. And then by not counting, and this is related, by not counting, some people ask, well, why do we need to count in the first place? Well, if we don't count, we lose a lot of very important information on the characteristics of cultural or creative or artistic work, such as mean wages, employment status, employment barriers, skills training, etc. And then obviously then there's this measurement issue that does not allow us to make cross-country comparisons very easily. So systems of measurement differ between countries. And then there's this other issue, which is the idea of measuring what we call sometimes embedded artists or creative workers, artists who work in non-arts occupations and industries. And that's, again, partly related to the problem of undercounting artists because of their high voluntary status in secondary work. And then another issue we've heard is the lag time in actually publishing the data. So often we don't get to see the data on employment for several months after it's collected, maybe sometimes years. And sometimes it's even difficult to get those data, especially in times like we're facing right now, where there's an urgent crisis where we see the deterioration of cultural employment related to the COVID-19 crisis. So those are all these different issues come across, both theoretical and practical, with measuring cultural employment. And this just really starts to get at those issues. So some potential solutions that I heard on the panel, but then also a couple of solutions that I've thought about myself. One is we've heard of partnerships between agencies that collect data and use the data. So for example, partnerships with agencies that collect business statistics and getting data from them. But I think in particular, there's a lot of opportunity for partnerships with agencies that collect individual income tax data. And this has often been the most difficult to access data in terms of difficult to access data for measuring cultural employment. A lot of the agencies that collect these data, due to the sensitivity of these data, do not want to share these data. But there are these methods to secure the anonymity of the observations of these data by requiring security clearance to access the microdata. But of course, there's a potential limitation here too, that this does not get at the voluntary activities in the creative and cultural fields. Another potential solution is partnerships, obviously, between countries to harmonize data sets. And this can be either through the national level statistics agencies or academic institutions or non-governmental entities. Eurostat is a great example of the harmonization across countries, but we could even do more. And then regional data collection efforts, providing information to national data collection efforts and agencies. And this could possibly help with imputation efforts in order to add information to national level data sources. And so a little bit of this is going on, but not as much as I think we would hope to go on. And then I think to get to Katja's last question about what can we do as sort of an international community working with cultural data, I do think that there's opportunity to create an international working group to address these issues that have been discussed. And this would create some degree of centralization and cooperation among all of the different actors involved in cultural employment data. And I think there's great opportunity here, and we haven't really seen this be done, I think, on a large scale effort yet. So I would welcome that opportunity down the line, especially as we really start going with, especially as we continue this conversation. So I'll just end with my last point, which is, if the point of collecting these data is for understanding policy development for workers and firms in agencies and cultural and arts sectors, I think we also need to have solutions that help facilitate access to the data by policymakers and agencies that work in this realm. So at this point, I would argue that many of the policies and programs we see being implemented are based on kind of gut instincts or maybe inconclusive or non-representative data due to the limitations that we've discussed in data collection. But any good data solution or solutions that we come up for measurement really need to also think about the end users of these data. With that, I would just say, I think, again, we have a lot of opportunity in this area and we have a long way to go, but again, a lot of experts who can add a really, really important beneficial information to the conversation. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanna, for this quite comprehensive summary. Well, unless maybe some of our speakers want to have a very quick reaction to what Joanna was saying. I don't know if anyone wants to take the floor. Maybe not, because I don't see the speakers, but that's probably fine. Well, if not, well, yeah, that's quite an exciting agenda ahead of us on maybe trying to improve step by step the way cultural employment is measured to better informed policies. Well, with that, I would like maybe to thank our speakers and to thank also our participants. And please join us tomorrow at 10 o'clock for the next session of this webinar, which will really focus now on policies. To support employment in creative sectors through the crisis and also in the recovery. With this, thank you very much and see you tomorrow. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.